It's been 50 years since Apollo 11 launched into space. It's the mission that began with President John F. Kennedy's challenge to send a man to the moon. CBS Evening News anchor Norah O'Donnell sat down with former U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Caroline Kennedy, to discuss her father's legacy. She also spoke with Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos on his venture focusing on the future of space tourism.
Caroline, why was space exploration so important to the president, your father?
He had talked about a new frontier in his speech at the convention.
The new frontier is here, whether we seek it or not. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space.
He really saw it as a way to mobilize our country in service of something that would advance freedom and benefit humanity.
I mean, in all the research and the interviews I've been doing, to think about that 500 million people watched the Apollo, I mean, that landing on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was a unifying moment, not just for Americans,
but
for the world. I mean, an incredible, we can't think of another moment really like that, when the world kind of gathered around to see what was really the beginning of the new frontier.
Well, it had been a symbol of the impossibility. Like everybody they would actually say, yeah, that'll happen when a man lands on the moon.
But of course, the Soviets had just launched Yuri Gagarin into space, and your father was anguished about it. He wrote letters to his vice president about it. Do you think it had not been for the Soviets that this would have happened?
Well, I certainly think it accelerated it. It added urgency to it.
I mean, Jeff, you talked about that, the idea of doing what was impossible, to get out there and before a joint session of Congress and said, we're going to put a man on the moon within a decade.
Mm-hmm. I guarantee you there were a lot of people at NASA that day gulping. We're going to what? Yeah, because that was an incredible challenge.
And then 1963, Apollo was over budget, and your father went to Cape Canaveral, and then he renewed his commitment to the Apollo program. How important was that kind of leadership at a time when people were starting to doubt the ability to do something so visionary?
Well, I think he had made the commitment, and he was determined to see it through, and I think he really believed. He had seen it firsthand. He had seen the dedication of the 400,000 people that were working on this. He'd seen the progress that had been made, and I think he really believed in the possibilities that it would open up for the American economy, but also the American imagination.
There's not been someone on the moon since 1972. I mean, what would your father think about what has happened? What has not happened?
Well, I think that the exciting thing that's happening is that there is this renewed energy and curiosity and passion and audaciousness to go back to space, to go beyond the moon. So I think he'd be really excited about that.
But it's not necessarily driven by government or presidential leadership. It's driven by the private sector.
I think it's some of both. I'm always amazed at the things that we can do. So at Blue Origin, we have a program called Blue Moon. We're going back to the moon. We're doing this with about 2,000 people instead of the 400,000 that were required in the 1960s. But why is that possible? Because we're using all these modern tools, you know, aero simulation tools and so on, that they just didn't have. And in fact, those tools have been made by NASA over the decades. So the only reason that we can do the things that we can do today is because we are, in fact, standing on the shoulders of giants.
You told your teacher in high school you were going to build a recreational park.
In space.
And then you said to your teacher, I'll get you a ticket.
Yeah, and I still owe her that ticket. It's coming.
What led to your fascination with space?
Well, for sure, the thing that started it was watching, you know, Neil and Buzz land on the surface of the moon, and I got infected by that. You don't choose your passions choose you. And then you start honing those things and paying attention to them. And so I've been dreaming and thinking and, you know, getting ready to do this kind of thing for a long time. We humans have to go to space if we're going to continue to have a thriving civilization. We've become big as a population, as a species, and this planet is relatively small, and we see it in things with like climate change and pollution and heavy industry. We are in the process of destroying this planet, and we've sent robotic probes to every planet in the solar system. This is the good one. So we have to preserve this planet, and we can do that using the resources of space. What our role is at Blue Origin is to help build the infrastructure so that future generations will be able to take those next steps that are important for this planet.
Explain what that means, the great inversion.
We send things up into space, but they're all made on Earth. Eventually, it will be much cheaper and simpler to make really complicated things like microprocessors and everything in space, and then send those highly complex manufactured objects back down to Earth so that we don't have the big factories and pollution-generating industries that make those things now on Earth. And Earth can be zoned residential.
How soon can that happen?
That's multiple generations, so I would think, kind of time frame of hundreds of years. And people are going to want to live on Earth, and they're going to live off Earth. They're going to be very nice places to live off Earth as well, and people will make that choice.
Isn't that incredible to think about, Caroline?
If I keep hearing Jeff say it, then I'm beginning to be able to imagine it. This is what audacious leadership is capable of doing.
We haven't landed someone on the moon since 1972. Did we stop caring? Did we stop dreaming? What happened?
No, I think my own feeling is that was, because it was a moment in history where that was really important to do. It got pulled forward. And it was such an audacious project that when it was finished, the resources to sustain it just weren't available. And today we can do it in a more sustainable way. So this time we're going to return to the moon, but to stay.
Caroline, is it time for a woman to set foot on the moon?
Of course it is. It's long past time. One of the really interesting things that I found is that there were women then who trained as astronauts, but they weren't allowed to participate. And one of them, really extraordinary, got the Nobel Peace Prize for her humanitarian flight work.
Jeff, do you imagine that Blue Origin will be the first company that returns us to the moon?
We're going to be, I hope, an instrumental part of it. This is such a big project, such a big undertaking. It will be done in cooperation with dozens of companies and governments. The Japanese are excited to be part of going back to the moon. The Europeans would like to be involved as well. The Europeans have this idea of a lunar village on the south pole of the moon. It's a very intriguing concept, and I think that's the kind of thing that will evolve over the decades.
In the 1960s, it was largely a race between countries. It now seems like a race between companies and billionaires. Is that how you see it?
Not to a degree, but I think that's probably a bit overdone. What we need is a dynamic, thriving space industry with thousands of companies. The problem today in space, price of admission as an entrepreneur to do anything interesting in space is too high. What I want to do is reduce that price of admission with reusable space vehicles so that future generation, the next generation, you can actually have two kids in a dorm room, build a great space company.
And necessary for that entrepreneurship to flourish,
Correct.
Because for you to start Amazon, the infrastructure already existed.
Yes, that's right, Nora. When I started Amazon, I didn't have to build a transportation network to deliver the packages. It existed. It was called the post office. I didn't have to build a payment system. It existed. It was called the credit card, and so on and so on. So all the infrastructure was in place. That's not true of space today. So to do something interesting in space, you have to start with hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars.
But why are you willing to spend billions of dollars of your own money to make that happen?
Because I think it's important. I think it's important for this planet. I think it's important for the dynamism of future generations. It's something that I care deeply about, and it's something I've been thinking about all my life.
When do you envision that this could be possible?
Building reusable vehicles, that's what's going to happen in my generation. So that's happening right now. And we have a vehicle that we're building and launch in 2021 called New Glenn, named after the first American to orbit the Earth, John Glenn. And that is a very large vehicle, and it's going to be part of returning humans to the moon.
Both of you and your families have a relationship with John Glenn, and I know he wrote you.
He wrote me the most beautiful letter just a few days before he passed away, and I have it framed in my office, and it's very meaningful to me.
He said in that letter, "I can tell you I see the day coming when people will board spacecraft the same way millions of us now board jetliner. When that happens, it will largely be because of your epic achievements." Really? Like we board spacecraft like jetliner?
I think that's entirely believable. If you went back in time 100 years and told people today that you would be able to buy a ticket and fly across the world on a jetliner, they would have thought you were crazy. Mm-hmm. But that's the kind of change that can happen in just 100 years or less.
You mentioned these reusable rockets. How critical is that technology to what you're talking about?
Reusability is the key to everything here for a launch vehicle because it's so expensive if you build this giant vehicle to aerospace hardware perfection, use it one time and throw it away at the bottom of the ocean. You'll never drive costs low enough to be able to do interesting things in space if that's your approach. So you need real reusability. It has to be operational so that it can't be the kind of reusability where you use it and then you land it, but then you have to inspect every component and disassemble everything and then clean it and reassemble it, and that also won't work. You can imagine how expensive your vacation to Disneyland would be if after they flew you there, you had to have the whole plane disassembled and inspected. That's not going to work. So we need real operational reusability.
President Trump said that we shouldn't be talking about the moon. We did that 50 years ago. How important is presidential leadership?
Well, I guess it depends on what president and where they're leading us, but I think certainly this Apollo mission to the moon is an example of presidential leadership that unites Americans. I think that leadership and believing in first the leader and then making you believe in yourself is what's absolutely critical. That's what President Kennedy did, I think, for a whole generation.
Jeff, do you need the support of the president? Do you need the support of the government in order to do what you're doing?
To go back to the moon and the time frame that the administration wants to do, which is 2024, we absolutely need the support of the government to do that. Mm-hmm. To do it on a longer time frame, we could more slowly but surely do it on our own.
What would space tourism look like?
Space tourism is going to start with a very short kind of 11-minute ride up into space. You'll be above the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers, 62 miles up. You'll be able to see the thin limb of the Earth's atmosphere and see how fragile this planet really is. Everybody who goes to space says they come back a little changed and they realize how beautiful this planet is and how small and fragile it is. Something that we can't see when we're down here, but from up there it becomes obvious. So that's the same journey that Alan Shepard took. The vehicle is called New Shepard, and we've already flown it many times without people on it. It's completely autonomous, and we're getting very close. This year, we're going to be flying humans in New Shepard for the first time.
Mm-hmm. And how many people will be on the New Shepard?
The crew capsule holds 6 people.
Would you be interested in doing it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, actually, I'd like to go to the moon. Well, I'd like to go to Mars, actually.
You would?
Yeah, I
Why?
definitely would. Why? Because it's Mars.
Adventure.
Yeah, exactly. I would love to do that.
You envision in your lifetime you'll go into space, Jeff?
Oh, for sure. People go into space just because they want to see it. They're curious. They want to have that experience. They want to float weightless in zero gravity and do somersaults and all of that. And then, because they're doing that, the technology will improve, the cost will come down, and then you get on a nice kind of virtuous cycle.
This is more than just a hobby for you.
I'm doing this because it's important. And for most of human history, up until very recently, we have been small and the planet has been big. But that's not true anymore. And we need to, if we're going to continue to have a dynamic civilization where our grandchildren have better lives than we do, and their grandchildren have even better lives, then we need to be sure we're using the resources of space to save this planet.